Hello everyone, today we introduce the Bande d'Ordonnance, units of the regular French army established in the mid-15th century and that constitute one of the earliest forms of permanent armies, in this case that were to remain for good within the French one in the Middle Ages. The concept of permanent army in this sense is relatively vague because the same France, for example, between the 60s and the 70s of the 14th century after the first truce of the Hundred Years' War with England had already been maintaining under Charles V some companies that essentially remained in service commissioned by the monarchy with the purpose of maintaining this pool of troops readily available for further military operations. But as we have seen very often, the concept of permanently maintained forces by a certain degree had always existed in every culture by some degree, right? As long as you have someone that pays for you and maintains you for a while, right? Just for, even if it were just for a service that in some time would have not in fact been needed anymore, but just the fact that they were there and somebody provides mostly provides you essentially with a salary, but in other cases also with natural goods, with the panoply, etc., had always been there. Permanent troops in the seigneurial retinues, and also in that sense in the royal one, had always been there by some degrees, just they were not normally field armies entirely. That costed an awful lot, and that the statal systems didn't have essentially the resources to afford them for long periods of time. So as we have just outlined, that maintaining troops after a war, a campaign, that also during winter, and saying, okay, well, next year we will use them because war is likely going to break out again, is how it started to happen. And you can't say just this started first here or there, right? As we will see, there were other powers in Europe that basically had been doing the same thing, but again, by some degree, it had always existed. We name France first because this was the largest and more powerful state in Europe, and as we've seen also recently for some videos regarding French politics, administration, centralization, etc., it was the one that had, also considering the extension and the threats, the surrounding enemies, etc., had always had this greater need for a more kind of hegemonic status in the first place, and therefore a greater territorial control. And in fact, a terrestrial military culture that would be essentially the most developed one, right, up to the contemporary era, and that had always qualified, in fact, the French armed forces since this very beginnings in many ways. But as we'll see, the French were in part also drawing inspiration, as Philippe de Comines says, from other powers that already did this. For example, the Italian city-states already maintained thousands of heavy cavalry de facto in pretty similar ways. The main problem here was not even strictly a military one. It was essentially an administrative one. Which force did the monarchy have to impose not just a discipline and a control on these armed forces, but also where would it draw the resources from, right? From which communities, and also with which competition within the same realm, right? And so, as always, when we talk about military reforms, we don't have to think about anything specifically technical or something that changed from a day to another, as if somebody decided to change the army for how it was and especially how it worked, right? From a strictly tactical operational point of view, there was absolutely, like for any military reform, de facto no change, right? Wars are fought by themselves. Military systems adapt to it simply, and do not wait for somebody from the top to kind of change the thing at the root. It just evolve like that. And the main problem is always administrative. It's always organization. It's always, okay, we see this new needs, so let's see how effectively we can improve mostly the availability of these troops. And it's mostly a political problem at the end of the day. Again, everybody knew more or less how to create a more centralized power had they had the resources, and the resources were drawn from communities. So the problem was always, as always, for any possible circumstance, political, right? War is just an instrument of politics, right? And it works exclusively like that. It has nothing, no autonomy whatsoever, no possible detachment from politics whatsoever in Clausewitzian terms, as we know. And that's mostly the problem. So that's the thing that this, I think, brief video I would like to leave you mostly with is the background, the context of the French monarchy at this point, right? Why did they come up by essentially the mid 15th century, having already tried this before, right? And why the bande d'ordonnance that also became quite famous, as you know, also during they remained throughout all the modern age, and they were in fact the backbone of the French army, with the gendarmes, that is the men at the arms, fundamentally with the retinues that again were pretty much the same, like in all the rest of Europe, from the Italian barbuta to the German glaive, etc. They work all exactly in the same way on the field. I made a video already about the Burgundian army organization. They are pretty old ones, telling you the truth, and so I will come back on the Burgundian military at this point in history, hopefully soon. It is important to stress that the bande d'ordonnance spread from France in this other, and de facto French powers, the Duchy of Burgundy evolved like a Burgundian state also across the French boundary with the Holy Roman Empire. That also also Brittany, the Duchy of Brittany, adopted the bande d'ordonnance and made a video about medieval Brittany last spring. So we will talk about these systems also in detail. In fact, we will have to talk about the French standing army from this mid-15th century military reforms more in detail, because the bande d'ordonnance were not the only permanent forces that the French at this point began to maintain. As another very important element were the Frank archers that were not particularly appreciated by some degree, but there are, different opinions regarding this, and the problem mostly being that France had a dramatic, as you know, nobiliar ethos, and therefore it was very difficult to reform the army in a pro-infantry sense. There were some infantry, properly native French infantry forces that were developed in parallel. Eventually the ordonnance updated over time. Today we stopped in the Middle Ages, but I made, for example, a video about the native French infantry during the Italian wars, which is a relatively niche topic because, as you know, at the time mostly the French usually hired Swiss infantry en masse, and this had the advantage that when they were done with them, these would go back to Switzerland. They wouldn't become a dangerous class of armed commoners that would use their military experience to challenge the nobiliar establishment in the same France. So mostly the gendarmes appear as the men-at-arms of the bande d'ordonnance, as together with naturally the nobiliar forces that still existed next to these essentially royal army, and that, however, were reduced in size. And this is also the important thing, that this reform was deeply political, also because it basically prevented at the same time the noble retinues to expand, right, more without royal permission beyond a certain threshold, fundamentally, numerically. And so it was a gradual attempt of political and territorial reaffirmation of the French monarchy after as you know, the victory at the siege of Orléans. These initial reforms began 10 years later, so in a moment in which the French were coming back and were essentially reconquering the lands that the English and the Burgundians had deprived them of. And as we will see, there is also in fact an important territorially garrisoning function along the frontier of the Bande d'Ordonnance. And recently I made a video about the English field army strength that partly talked about this. Also the aforementioned videos about the French, say, centralized system, peripheral administration, and not just in France, telling the truth, but that explained mostly what the needs were. I also made a fortunate video about the medieval French nobility last month that talks about the elevation of also, in fact, provincial elements to knighthood in different ways, the one that had traditionally happened exactly because of this necessity of, first of all, countering partly the same nobility that was rebellious and causing some of the greatest trouble in the process. I mean, just think about the Burgundians in that sense, but also within the same nobles and the same military companies that the French king employed in the 100 Years' War. And that explains the need to provide, especially in fact, the peripheral centers, the one that were more threatened by the English chevauchés, of some permanent garrison force that was also at some point eventually to pass to counterattack, but that initially was important to ensure properly the loyalty of these centers while the English were ravaging all around, and considering also the benefit that some, the pro-English faction could gain by surrendering those centers to the enemy. So that's another issue, and we'll have to talk a lot about this as well. So the so-called standing army in France had already been experimented, as we were saying before, after the Treaty of Bretigny, and this was basically more a theoretical than a practical reality, as we've just seen, because first of all, it was a matter of pay there too, right? It was not very romantic ideal. The monarchy had not had the resources to maintain, to salary those troops. These would have and did in fact fluctuate drastically. Also because the wages frequently remained unpaid, right? These were commissioned troops fundamentally, but the monarchy had its own problems, massive debts, all the war going on. Essentially France falling apart as a political unit at that time. So after that, the first phase of the 100 Years' War, say, and so the ensuing peace, the French monarchy began to stop paying also these enormously costly troops, as the main problem went away after a while, and trying to reorganize the state, first of all, even just for a future possibility of paying more troops. That were always the main problem. Like the main problem of a pre-industrial system, as always, first of all, is paying the army. The army is the greatest expense by far, right? Is also the most emergentially needed. At some point, the costs are enormous, and even they are because they are political costs. You have to convince somebody to provide with men and material for that military service. And so you understand why that coming back, as we were saying before, occurred after the French, coming back. In fact, in the latter phase of the 100 Years' War, when they began to regain territory, and this momentum allowed the French to find the resources they were moral largely, right? This was a great state that had suffered an incredible blow but had remained to stand on its feet, and because the population fundamentally sided at the end of the day with monarchic cause, mostly, not entirely, but proving at the end of the day that the system had been solved. That at the beginning of the 100 Years' War, France had just come out of a phase of essentially continuous expansion since the end of the 12th century, especially the beginning of the 13th. And so the state that had been formed by the Carpathians and the early Valois was the product of also a contingental development. It was not really teleological or progressively thought, right? They had to cope even there with the enormous problems in spite of the favorable historical phase, let's say, because maintaining that state was still a big challenge, and the English at that point came in that moment of crisis and recession of medieval Europe that had kind of crippled significantly these giants of the 13th, early 14th century. And it's not until the mid-15th, in fact, that France manages finally to recover its own, hardcore base capacity of, reconquering the lost territories. We can already see that after 1380, that initial experiment to maintain this essentially mercenaries that had already been part of the army at some point, but just not being disbanded afterwards, after the war, was dissolved, right? And so only in the mid-15th century you have again the plans for establishing a full-time army revived. I talked about mercenaries because this is de facto what the French army was made up, like all the European ones at the time, right? Today we have distinguished kind of in a romantic and a categorical sense of mercenaries and national forces. As a matter of fact, it was, and there still is, not really much of a difference. Like, mercenary is it's become semantically kind of a loaded with negative meanings. But what's the difference between somebody who receives money for service and anyone else, right? Independently from what they do. The mercenary forces throughout all history have always proven to be fundamentally reliable, right? And they are unreliable where you start losing. And of course, why would they have to stick with you if you are the one, not just that, is providing with more risk at that point, but also with less resources to pay back, right? And very often, in fact, this was also cause of attrition in moments of victory, not much because of a mercenary greed that existed, like, everyone is trying to profit from war in a way or another, but just in different dimensions, but because in fact the polities were not willing to pay these forces. And so given that in many ways these were professional troops that constituted the backbone of the armies themselves, it could be quite risky at a point to do so, because yes, you would have had to pay a lot, and so it was kind of more convenient not to pay them by a certain point, but also they were a violent force that could simply seize what they wanted if they were unopposed by some other kind of regular force, right? That could be still other mercenaries, as a matter of fact. And the difference between, in fact, a national and a mercenary force doesn't even practically exist, because let's leave aside that nations at the time were something different from today, even though in embryo, yes, mostly Europeans were, nationally defined already by some standard at that time. But first of all, again, that kind of allegiance to a state was something very different than today, if anything, because that state was very fluctuating and still, again, composed by lots of communities that also had a dramatically different mindset in terms of kind of properly on the concept of authority compared to what we have today, because they still saw themselves as, conferring power to that authority, and not really, and they were much closer to the consequences of not supporting it in terms of eventual disgregation of the same power than we are today, where we always complain about the state, but finally we're just here pretending everything from it, and we objectively don't have much convenience from tearing it down. That's another story. At the time, there was generally a much greater instability, and the opportunities that could rise contingentally for different estates, single commanders, even within the same dynastic rule. I mean, the same Valois Burgundy were, they were essentially French royalties and so on, were say enough to create the situation very complicated. Many mercenaries used by the French were French, right? There were also many other nationalities. The French of the north are not the French of the south, because in the south they were not even French. They were Gascons, they were Provençals, that provided with an important amount of mercenaries, given also the general decline that southern France had undergone since the Capetian conquest. Brittany, that we've seen also as a bit of a wilder land in a recent video about the moral, ethnic, and cultural background of late medieval, early modern mercenaries, in fact, figure prominently. There were Scots, as you know, that hated the English gods, and so they wanted to fight, and they did fight for the French on the continent. There were Germans. There were many nationalities in general, especially the 14th century is a moment of great, kind of a great national blend nationalities. It came literally from everywhere. By the 15th century, especially this northern French situation, where mostly the 100-Year War was fought, mostly has this more, what has become also in popular culture a bit more of stereotypical idea of the Middle Ages altogether, this northwestern European dimension with mostly those nationalities, and surely the development of a specific military culture that has many interesting aspects in parallel if you look at France, Burgundy, England, certain areas of Germany, and also this other kind of fringe areas both in France and in the British Isles. But generally speaking, the companies that were paid for military service by the kings were just local ones. It's like the English indenture, right? Mostly were English noblemen themselves that were just in the business of war on their own, and they received this monarchic commissions, and they would go with that. It was just a living, right? The problem is that in that mess that the 100 Years' War was, and even in moments of French victory, still so wide areas of the country still effectively abandoned to themselves, and so exposed to the brutality of these marauders that the mercenaries transformed themselves in. The greatest challenge facing the Valois monarchs became the need to control their own armed forces. Right? There had been, for example, the Écorcherie of 1435. Écorcherie means the slaughter, right? Which is quite meaningful. And again, yeah, it was a temporary situation. It's a mess. The king is not yet so powerful. We are kind of noblemen with these companies, and we can exploit this moment to become ever more powerful, and so to avoid even more being say the political the political situation of being persecuted and punished for our crimes. This would happen very often. The same troop would do that because they were also not paid, or they didn't have any other way to sustain themselves, which is yet another thing. But surely it's not really a moment of great moral height regarding most of these incidents. It's just they had the power. They knew they were not to be punished. They would do that. And the origins of the Bande d'Ordonnance can be found in the general estates summoned at Orleans in 1439. So very meaningful location because it had represented the Valois last stand, successful in this old royal city that withstood the English onslaught, and it was basically the last stronghold of the French monarchy, and where the way, in fact, was paved for the reform, suggesting first of all a limitation of the number of troops that could be maintained by feudal lords. that was already seen as the major problem, naturally referring mostly to Burgundy, but in a sense, probably relieving many fief holders that were also kind of the smaller ones were also exhausted by the war, were definitely not much of the they could definitely participate to the military companies that carry out various devastations, but they were not the anymore the much of the leaders per se. They were maybe the final rank men at arms, if we can say, and that were just now essentially being hegemonized by other more powerful figures. Could be the Burgundians, could be the English, could be other French noblemen that, however, had ever greater power. So the estates of Orléans allowed the nobility no more than small garrisons for their castles, which was kind of a radical imposition that, as we will see now, would cause a major revolt exactly the following year. Also, however, probably the creation of a standing army was proposed in the process. And the concept was simple. It was, after all, a dynamic that we find in every post-war situation where it was still going on. But at this point, the taking of control by the French again was bringing to the extension of the rule on areas that had been devastated by the war. So the need for a greater power being conferred to the king as the one that would also continuously expand in late medieval France later was at this point accepted generally, right? Especially the people such. So this situation as okay, let's confer more power to the monarchy, because first of all, in France, this, differently from England, had always been kind of the general trend, right? Also, juridically speaking, the king had more prerogatives. There was a tradition, right, a customary, reliance on the monarchy for solving more matters than, say, in England, where there was instead, after that, there was actually more centralized since Bouvines, and after that, as you know, was significantly crippled by the baronial rule, and statally speaking, this was not actually a big win, right? In retrospect, you can say that, of course, the Magna Carta made England and the UK, the British Empire, in the way we know, but it's an accident of fate, right? It's not really what happened in 1215 and with later constitutions was not really a positive event in the broader civilizational development of the English state and monarchy, right? And there is a reason also why France was again more advantaged in this state building process that helped them dramatically during the 100 Years' War, and so this power would be conferred also by reducing the power of local lords, who were seen, in a sense, a bit still like mobsters of some sort, and everything would be entrusted in everything. I mean, an important part of French military power would be entrusted to directly the king's administration, right? All the resources that were essentially unspent now by the nobility because of their the fact that they were not allowed anymore to have unless with the monarchic assent, large forces on their own would be simply used to fuel to pay sustain a French statal army that was still, however, seeing the commissions paying the nobles, right? But such connection, however, being strictly hinged to the monarch, right? So these commissions were also a way of political competition, of status promotion within the same stattal administration, the court, etc. And still, the nobility had a great importance there. So, not that they were taken out altogether, but their political autonomy was sensibly reduced. And consider that, in fact, at this point, the reform that was effectively issued in 1445 would entail with the bande d'ordonnance, the Compagnies de l'ordonnance du roi, right? So of the king, meant that the French royal army had already an important upper hand on the internal balance at that point of war. They were armed, they were ready also to repress opposition, and this is exactly what happened, in fact. As the year after the General Estates at Orléans, the so-called Praguerie revolt broke out. These were essentially princes and other nobles, unsurprisingly, against Charles VII. And it was known as Praguerie because it alluded to similar contemporary movements that were happening in Prague at the time and elsewhere in Bohemia because of the Hussite movement, etc. That was quite a different thing, but it had still had an important anti-monarchic dimension. And as early as April 1437, as a matter of fact, some princes had already been rebelled because they had been excluded from the royal council, so that general direction and sensible political choice, because this had been quite ambiguous, and Charles VII now could rely just on some specific leaders and not risk into this kind of broader dependence on other individuals, had unsuccessfully plotted to reassert their influence. So it was not really a very distanced political climate. And when Charles VII issued the ordinance forbidding the raising or maintenance of troops without permission, the first of his great ordinances for military reform, de facto, mercenary captains who felt their livelihood threatened joined with the rebellious princes. They were led by Charles I, Duke of Bourbon, Jean II, Duke of Alençon, and also with the 16-year-old Dauphin, that would become later Louis XI, that would unironically actually extend the same ordinances. So this was at the time it was just a figurehead to say, okay, we have still someone, and specifically the heir, to legitimize our rebellion, and which broke out in Poitou in February 1440, they were quite soon put to corner by the Constable de Richemont, so that they withdrew to Bourbon. That would remain, as you know, also for the French monarchy later on, a very like a princely state within the state. It would also defect to the Habsburgs during the Italian wars. However, the rebels at this time were again defeated in July, and making peace, by the way, on very generous terms at Coucy. Right? So the problem was initially settled this way because, again, probably Charles VII knew that that was a good moment to strike against this too encumbrant nobiliar interference in the stattal affairs. And the rebels on that occasion, by the way, also proposed peace with England, a lessening of taxation. The towns and the people stood loyally by the king instead, right? And this is very meaningful. As most things today, actually, those who ask for reducing taxation, it's not much the poorest, right? It's those who have some greater interests that may be, surely positive for the development of the same clienteles, but that at the same time can go against the political unity. As such, in moments of broader crisis, like the country torn apart, still with the English occupying large parts of it, Burgundy allied with the enemy. So there was also an attempt to renew the Praguerie through an assembly at Nevers in 1442, but this was thwarted by Charles VII's diplomacy as well. So this actually was a great display of monarchic force and of a successful formula after all. The real establishment of the Compagnies de l'ordinance, however, took place in the spring 1445, authorizing the raising of 15 companies, again, Compagnies de l'ordonnance du roi, or ordinance companies, in fact, from among the more reliable elements of the large number of mercenaries made redundant by the Truce of Tours with England the year before, 1444. What happened practically is that the majority of the companies that had been employed by the French during the war were disbanded, right? So this still shows that, of course, the state could not afford and would have been, useless given the enormous costs that these forces had to maintain them further. But a limited number of captains were commissioned to assemble new commands to be garrisoned in frontier towns, for which, in fact, they were to be regularly paid and supplied by the monarchy. Right? So this is the meaning properly of the ordinance companies of the king. Right? That the general cost, again, that could be saved from partly the nobiliar, say, unspent resources, and the disbandment of other mercenaries could be used by the monarchy to regularly pay and supply these forces. This was naturally also a moment of great moral force being displayed. I mean, the country was at war, so there were very deep, strong, bitter motivations from both sides to keep up with the struggle, right? So resources would be found as well in that specific moment. But the important thing here is that we have, for the first time, and for good, because again, these companies were to remain as the backbone of the French army, a real permanent professional force, right, of already military professionals who were regularly paid and to go on with their duty by the French king, right? These new companies were composed of up to 100 lance fournis. Fournis means kind of supply the kit, right? Furnished in practice. As you know, which meant essentially that they were paid for maintaining an important retinue, right? That theoretically represented one man at arms, so the gendarme, 2 archers, and 3 servants, as well as their horses. Actually, numbers vary regarding this, and it's absolutely normal because there was not a real uniformity ever. Like, the commissions were just essentially substantiating in the amount of money these people received, and then the key element in the reform, as we were saying before, was less military than administrative, as the crown worked through regular masters, inspections, payments by commissioners, controllers, and treasurers of war to enhance military discipline. But as we were just talking about in that video about the peripheral administration during the late Middle Ages, these officials were far from the court. They could, arrange the things their own way. there was, as we'll see now, no real organic uniformity. The important was essentially counting on those who had proven to be the most loyal captains that still were often not particularly loyal also afterwards to the king. But the important aspect of the story is that each company that was raised by these captains had still to swear loyalty to the king altogether, right? Its members, the troop, had to still prove that they were committed to the royal cause. The company, as we've seen, comprised 100 lances, the lance fournies, each of a number that varied. There is, as we've seen here, it's like three fighters plus two aides, but some say that there were 6 mounted men, right? For example, the Chronique de Mathieu de Scucy says that 6 men were a man-at-arms, a page, 3 archers, and a couturier. There was kind of a lighter horseman, while Alain Chartier, that was Charles VII's secretary, by the way, states that they comprised men-at-arms, page, 2 archers, couturier, and a valet de guerre, or gros valet, which makes you understand, naturally, also the valet, who was really a valet. They were people that were really trained to fight in many situations, and also what they found, what they were habituated to by serving the men-at-arms and so on. And considered that there was still a big deal of kind of clientele connection in this regard. The force altogether never attained its proposed maximum of 1,200 men. That would have been roughly 20 companies, right? And the company, again, was still the base of the military organic in late medieval Europe. The company was a bit the broader point of reference, the essentially the most important tactical unit on the field as well, in terms of unity of command, tactical autonomy, etc. So you understand, as it always happened with commissioned troops, these men received a pay, and then they would essentially maintain less forces than they should have had, so that they could essentially capitalize on it. Some ghost troops on the rolls. There was a great deal of corruption in the process, so it's not that they managed to enrich themselves more than much through that, but it was just a living. I made a video about this. It's a very famous, standard, universal dynamic all over, again, pre-contemporary armed forces, how to speculate on the commissions. But it was still a significant amount of troops. For example, right, these forces were to augment over time. Mathieu de Couchy tells us that, quote, although the number of soldiers paid in this way rose to some 9,000 or 10,000 horse, there were not many of them in the towns. As we were saying before, this was also the broader point of the reform, also to garrison specific centers, right, and or to allow other ones, as we've seen also, as town popular areas were kind of, generally speaking, more pro-royal than the nobility or countryside, let's say, and that could afford, especially in the larger centers, to maintain more troops, as we'll see, were kind of diluted, wouldn't even become a threat for the local commune, for the local administrators, let's say. In fact, each captain was posted in a different major town, which, with its surrounding countryside and district, provided his company's salary, right? So, and there were detachments also quartered in smaller neighboring towns, so to dilute also locally the weight, the burden, and properly the building of the troops, because this was also the thing. There were not real barracks at this time. Troops were billeted in some cities. I made a video still about the France of 200 years later, the one about the French dragonnade, right? And see how the monarchy, for example, used to build troops violently among the Huguenot communities at that point, essentially looting them, etc., to partly solve the problems of maintaining these forces. It's already in Louis XIV's time, before his great reforms, military reforms that would create, in fact, a permanent army in barracks, etc., that were already partly there, but these other troops that were to be lodged in some way, they hadn't already found one fact. But this, again, it would be also in the political, juridical, administrative development of modern Europe, basically the major problem again for this of the time. The local communities were forced to maintain some troops locally, and they would essentially give up some of their some of this burdens for some taxes to centralize further, so that the government administration, it would become more powerful, but at least this man would have not had to maintain the troops locally anymore, right? This is how the contemporary state essentially formed over time. And usually the troops were billeted, let's say, in these towns, let's say 20 to a maximum of 50 lances number, right? So not really a few, but still enough to be some sort of protection, and were furnished with lodgings by the town authorities. They had provided for that. Each lance specifically must have a room with a fireplace, 3 beds, linen, kitchen utensils, and a stable, right? So an important cost for sure. But as we were saying before, for example, at Troyes, Chalon, Reims, Laon, and other similar centers, there were no more than 24 to 30 lances, right, according to the size and strength of the town. So this was the point. The soldiers didn't have to be numerous enough to take on control or ascendancy over the local communities, the so-called good people that had important contacts with royal administration and the inhabitants, right? So this territorialization of the company, its subordination to the monarchy that had an ever greater political and territorial control, and could scientifically, through the local administrators, kind of distribute the troops so that it wouldn't become a political and order problem, right? Of course, ordinance soldiers often relapse into indiscipline, right? As they were, like, there was not really a difference between civilian and military life, especially for people, again, that had gone through the war and just were habituated to kill and butcher and rape on a regular basis. But the companies were still under the royal watch, right? And the royal forces in this regard were also aware of the role they had, the security that these commissions would provide in that position, right? Also compared to the rest of the nobility, was powerful and jealous of these forces as well. So even though these troops were often more loyal to their leaders than to the monarchy per se, they still represented a dramatic improvement, becoming the backbone of royal armies for the next century, right? We know that further 5 companies were raised in 1446, when the system was extended also to the south of France, to the Languedoc. And by Louis XI's reign, the ordinance companies comprised in total 236 lances, or 15,816 men, right? This is said by Philippe de Comines, that also knew importantly about military affairs, as we have discussed in different videos. For example, the one about collective discipline in late medieval Europe that I made some week ago. An author who says that at the Battle of Monthl'héry in 1465, Louis XI had with him, quote, all the ordinance companies of the kingdom, which could well total about 2,200 men at arms. Albeit the same source admits that over 500 had defected to the Duke of Brittany as well. So this tells you still how complex and difficult the control over these forces really was. Also in campaign, right, where there were strong enemies still capable of exercising that political influence among your troops as well. A very interesting note by Comines is that we were hinting at before, is that the creation of the Compagnies d'ordinance was in imitation of the armies maintained by the Italian states, that often do not figure in this kind of broader attention towards the say state building, because there is the idea that the condotta at some point was not successful during the Italian wars, etc. But if you pick the thing from a strictly military point of view, and you observe the organic, how they were in fact maintained and controlled by the local states, the Italians had already been fielding essentially semi-permanent forces, essentially just like the French had done since the time of Charles V, the 60s, 70s. If you look at the Duchy of Milan or the Republic of Venice, this had very often, especially the former, that was more of a properly territorial state since early times, things like 6,000, 7,000 men at arms plus their retinues, right, under their control, and probably also with actually a higher quality of the cavalry per se, because if you look at the various retinues of the various men at arms in Europe, you find that Italians had very few retinue, and very often considered that we're pioneering also the armor development technology, etc. And so the idea is that these were massive shock cavalry forces that were maintained for that kind of intensive, immediate, quick shock use. Right? They had retinues. Very often, there is no way really to distinguish too much. Again, the number of the following, because as we were saying before, they fluctuated everywhere in Europe. But still, there were some more or less differentiated trends, and that would be interesting to study as well. And the problem here, the reason why such historiographical differences are not assessed sometimes, is that we tend to neglect the art of war per se. That is to say, very often late medieval historiography has a bias towards this administrative sources. So that is, dispositive sources, mostly statutes, ordinances, things like this, that say something, say, okay, we have to maintain this amount of troops, and then the same authors do not study how these troops were actually fielded like, and that there is a completely different thing, because normally there is no source telling you, right? It's not that you study late medieval warfare and you say, well, okay, there are archive sources that tell you how many troops there were in this army, right? There is no such thing. There was no, first of all, permanent army by a unitary dimension. That is to say, even if there was this core of maintained troops, again, from the mid-15th century, mostly in France, or Italy, or mostly these were the most advanced areas. Um, this was just the backbone, right? All the other troops were filled. You don't have a record of the entire army. Of all the Middle Ages, we have just one source, a single one, of 1260, that by chance we got about one army at that point. And for the rest, and that is also kind of a sort of an administrative source, because it doesn't literally tell you what's the entirety of the army like, but at least it tells you how there are the roles, who is present, who is not, etc. So it tells a lot. But for the others, you have none of that. You have chronicles that are truly the only source that tells you how many troops were there, right? And there is a disgusting bias against chronicles, mostly from a certain part of Western historiography, that has diverted the attention from how war was really fought. Because if you take away narrative sources, you will never know anything about medieval armies. Zero, right? The 95% of what we know about medieval warfare is entirely the chroniclers, right? But since there are certain countries where scholarship is being considered even more important than sources traditionally, and so it's just the interpretation of these great authors that should make you understand things, and these authors not even study sources because they think they are the only depositories of knowledge. So even if they write bullshit, they are the scholars, right? And that's the reason why certain of these environments haven't produced anything good for 50 years, and called for papers, and but it's become disgusting. Like, properly, I'm not specifically mentioning which area, but mostly, we know it's supposed to be the most advanced historiography in the world, one that has written more, etc. They have completely collapsed, right? So in fact, I have much greater confidence towards specific countries in Europe. There are very few, and the non-obvious ones that can still write good things, because historiography, unfortunately, is something too serious that people don't talk about, because they're just a big deal self-promotion in terms of, look, I'm the special university in the world because, I have fountains where people can drink, or, because my financial assets are fine. Then, you don't study shit, and you did the PhDs you produce, like medieval historians that can't even translate Latin, and grossly undereducated pieces of trash that, just have stopped considering history as an existential occupation, and just, making those things that make them formally qualified and substantially not at all, frankly, is the norm, right? So if you... I was explaining partly these things in that video about the English field army strength during the 100 Years' War, because at the end of the day, they have to surrender themselves to the fact that that's a beautiful example, that if you don't have chroniclers, you will never know how large medieval armies really were. And chroniclers are absolutely not people inventing numbers just per se, and they're actually very accurate most of the times. You don't find people talking about dragons or talking about billions of troops. No, they say the thing for how it's plausible, right? And we'll talk more about organic, because I will also be writing something about this, and it's just an entire side of the story is not being told. So people focus like on the administrative system, on the recruitment system, and all these issues, but they don't see how eventually armies really fought. The same topic I discussed in that video about the Burgundian ordinances that would allegedly show these various tactical, these formations of the army that were discussed by the Burgundian High Command before the battle. And people, look at these things, and they're very complex and refined, etc. But you understand they were kind of mind games. When you look at battles, you know that the armies were arrayed in a very different way, which was also, by the way, a much simpler one, obviously, and also a much closer one similar one to one of the enemies, which is yet another thing that is normally not much understood, that basically in Western Europe, people fought in the same way everywhere, right? When you look at these Compagnies, band d'ordinance, you look essentially at heavily armored cavalry with mounted archers, right? Consider that, yeah, I mean, there is a difference between tactics at a point, but again, up to a certain point, the French also fought dismounted very often as men at arms. Mounted archers were there, foot archers were there. The Scottish archers were there, the Franc archers were there, right? And some sources even claim that they were fundamentally just like the English ones, in terms of quality and there's a debate about this because still, the English, of course, maintain some standards for some specific reason that are like political before military. But in fact, the technique, the standard were pretty much the same. They were the same countries at the end of the day, also in material culture and technology. So the problems are often sclerotized in a wargamistic way, saying, these guys fought just like this and like that. And whenever a person makes those distinctions, fundamentally that they haven't studied the entirety of the war, right? The only way you have to understand how medieval armies worked is to study for decades in detail an entire set. Let's say the 100 Years' War. I don't know any scholar that has studied in detail, that means reconstructed every single battle of the 100 Years' War from all the sources available. Right, it would take 60 years probably, but up until somebody does it, there's no way to have someone actually having even an opinion how these armies fought. And don't think, in fact, that medieval warfare is really known and understood, because nobody has made that crucial step. I can say that, without any modesty, that I did this. It took 4 years to do it at an earlier time for a specific regional area, and I discovered things that simply nobody in the entire history of historiography has ever come up with, for a reality that there is plenty of publications on, but given that nobody has studied the thing in that diachronic and comparative way, nobody has ever approached tactics, the art of war, in that evolutionary dimension. And of course, people just describe certain exterior features, but they don't really know how armies fought on the field in practice, because there is hardly, even in the so-called new military history, there isn't anything about that, right? It's just, let's study war again, and let's use an alibi to say, let's say that war is, must be studied because it, in function of politics and society. No, war must be studied as a discipline on its own. And up until you realize that there is no way for you to be a competent person, because the only way in the past these things were studied was like this. And a very few people in the world historically did it, but the ones who did it, including von Clausewitz, for example, had something to say about war that nobody else ever did. Guess why? Right? It's such a stupid behavior to pretend that we're great competent authors and scholars, and then you don't even do that. So what kind of specialists are you? That's the only thing I do personally. So I think that there is much to say regarding this, and it's so easy. By the way, I am doing it, and there's nobody who does it. So just imagine how it's so easy to write articles that are going around, because I'm the only person who does it. So it's that fascinating. Lots of people write lots of interesting things about war, but not about the art of war, right? So they can be dramatically helpful, because you can find all various examples scattered from their works, but their works are not about this specifically, right? And think about this. And if you look at the ordinance companies, you even realize they were tactically conservative, even in the 15th century, right? There is not a magic tactics that wins and the others are stupid and don't use it, and wars are fought like this. Cancel that from your mind, right? You don't win because of tactics only, nor even by the wide majority. You win for many other different reasons, right? But that's yet another thing. No, they won because, see, man, they fought on the field like that and the others didn't. And that's how it happened, man. It doesn't work like that. War does not work like that, right? And consider that there is also, aside, if you study the details of it, of the campaigns, etc., you just realize that quite easily, just by the habitude to numbers, to army compositions, to the kind of strategical, in fact, and tactical employing. You realize the differences were minimal, first of all, but secondly, that there was yet an enormous amount of warfare aside from the pitched battles. The pitched battles weren't at all rare in the Middle Ages, as people say, pitched battles were so rare, man, blah, blah. Pitched battles are rare pretty much in relative terms to the other operations. Unfortunately, the other operations are also, for some reason, not studied. People still keep studying the pitched battle. Guess why? We need fireworks. I know better because I studied the whole thing. So I studied pitched battles that are beautiful and that tell you much more about lots of details, because the other events are too small to even make the author say something meaningful about them. But still, through the mass of the latter, you can find some information that makes you realize how deep and wide and complex really war is, right? In case you just didn't notice theoretically, by knowing the basics, right, of strategy and tactics and what they mean and in which relation they are, and not just quantitatively and qualitatively, not just pretending to know what it is without, for example, not even knowing how to start from definitions. So again, watch the Von Krieger playlist, because without that you can't really understand warfare. I tell you by experience, right? The rest is just wishful thinking. Warfare is not, okay, now we'll sum up a bunch of stuff I read here and there and I will pretend that I'm a military expert. No, you must study campaigns and battles in detail. It takes years for some. Every single source that you have to find, and you have to be sure they are all different languages, and you must be able to translate them, not translate them with cheating without knowing the semantic difference. You must have a massive linguistical background. If you can't even start to do this, just do not even pretend you're a military expert, because those do not exist that way, you hope, right? So again, what we're looking at here is also about the permanent readiness of these forces, right? That arguably was one of the most impacting strategic advantages that France would have throughout the rest of the war that the kingdom won. As we were saying before, other princes such as the Dukes of Brittany and Burgundy soon imitated the ordinance. It was a pretty obvious principle that also in their states was developing, right? They were kind of exchanging these kind of things. For example, Burgundy was more advanced in the artillery park already, right? The amount availability of it. And France followed later, even though it was to become much more powerful than Burgundy. But this started earlier in Burgundy for other reasons that we'll see in other videos. But again, I created a medieval Burgundy playlist. You can check there something. I discussed it partly. And so there's also a similar civilizational stage of development, right? These innovations are quick to develop, because more or less we're talking about states of the same caliber, we could say, and or at least if not properly that, because eventually France again swallows everything, but at this point specifically, the very mid at the time of the reform, still look at Burgundy, it's a comparable military organization. Even Brittany is kind of less powerful, but at the core, it could work in the same way. Naturally, the companies enjoyed rising political, social, and military prestige, and this remains true for the remainder of the century. These were the king's soldiers, right? So they had a crucial role also in the recomposition of the French political territory, and also much of they were the protagonists of much of the military victories through which this was carried out. Appointment to command or serve in the Compagnie d'ordinance became a key form of princely patronage. Such service was ultimately restricted to the most privileged echelons of society. So that, again, great part of that nobiliary force we were saying before was partly channeled in this system. It was still the French army altogether, and considered that the nobility still had an influence on this system anyway, because they were the second most powerful force after the monarchy, and they more or less negotiated this whole thing as well, their involvement in it, etc. And these troops naturally could still be weaponized by the local nobility, right? Politically speaking, they could simply side with them at some point. After 1500, the spread of firearms, as you know, gradually rendered heavy armor useless. So in part there was a further spread of lighter cavalry and especially of infantry formations that would end the tactical preeminence of the companies for how they had been conceived still as a lance-based army, right? But the French gendarmes, as you know, maintained basically the stellar reputation as the best cavalry in Europe, which they objectively were. The French one had always been ever since Merovingian, Carolingian times, and the traditional characterization of the Bande d'Ordonnance as the first standing army in Europe, as we've seen, is perhaps too simplistic, but when you look at the significance of the innovation, especially that broader political, social background of the most important state in Europe regaining steam and fundamentally becoming the next continentally hegemonic threat for all the rest, well, you realize that if their forces were made up of this man, there is something very functional and very positive about them, and at some point even too much, because again the gendarmes, as you know, the French implemented everything by the time of the Italian wars, except native infantry, right? So this also provided France with some doubts, because if the French nobility had accepted a military reform that would entrust more power to the commoners, the sheer demographic and agricultural resources of France would have taken over Europe, just like it happened, in fact, when this happened in Napoleon with the Revolutionary Army and Napoleonic times. Instead, they probably lost also because of this, and it was rather the Habsburgic coalition that mostly managed to capitalize for this. But the tensions within the French state, as we've seen also with the Compagnies, when the nobility knew of these reforms in kind, said no, and instead were also brutally brought down. And this is really relevant. Consider that this rebellion again is an elite one, as we had an oligarchic one, not like the Jacquerie in the previous century, right? So it's, as I often say, the 100 Years' War is the triumph of an order embodied by the French monarchy, right? It's probably a statal model that would also trigger many important changes in Europe. Fundamentally, it was the most erosive in terms of, the universal tradition, because France would have ideally wanted to be the empire in Europe and would have dealt that. But in the process, it kind of weakened the same universal powers, right? They backed the Protestants against the Habsburgs. They threatened essentially to invade also their territory. So that was in perspective with lots of issues that invested France later. There's always this enormous force capable of an enormous change, but it also was very difficult to control, and that with the French Revolution went out of hand, but still during the 100 Years' War almost went out of hand. Also with the French Wars of Religion, it almost went out of hand. So, but France always came back on her feet, and this is also remarkable in perspective. There are other states in Europe that simply disgregated, were taken over by others, and when you look especially at the difference between Western and Eastern Europe, you realize how deep the divide really was in that sense. But let's say regularizing military service as a remunerative career, professionalizing the art of war, which in the process was taking place in this new elite, and providing a defense for the cooptation of the medieval aristocracy into the disciplined service of the modern state. Well, all this represented a decisive breach with the older traditions of war, right? It's this at the beginning of this very long path that would lead, and in which France again always pioneered, that saw the appearance of a full, complete, campaign-scaled, permanent army corps of a state that was integrated by mercenary forces within the Swiss, etc., up until it became fully statalized, which occurred 200 years later in the France of Louis XIV, right? And that other states in Europe also took time before reaching at those same levels, right? Mostly during the 18th century, and that especially was rendered universal by the French Revolution, at least in practice, though, because what a state in federal tradition does is not necessarily very different in practice from what a more kind of civil law centralized one, where the state is probably the only source of law really does. So we will have to talk about that, because it's also a very thought-provoking perspective, actually, what people from different political, cultural backgrounds really think of how their state work. And it's very often addressed in a simplistic way, for which, there is that on my channel I always talk about tradition and universality, but there is also always also in modernity, always a positive side and a negative one. And the fact that some negative one prevails doesn't mean that the potential that actually is at the base of such improvement really should be a problem, even for a universal tradition. And unfortunately, we can't even rely on people that really can be trusted, or not just as leaders, but as subjects. That's the problem mainly. It's not always there is this obsession with tyranny, which is a huge hypocritical flipping of reality. Nobody can rule if the people do not want that. Nobody, not even in totalitarian regimes. It's always and exclusively the people's fault, all the time. So what are we complaining about? Right? It's the most ridiculous thing to complain about tyranny if you're just sitting there doing nothing, right? Or doing something extremely stupid, like going around with guns without doing anything, realizing that the problem is cultural, that it's not you just going there changing anything, and actually creating much more problems to the system, or even going the opposite direction by providing with an example of, some lunatic goes around thinking to change the system this way without actually even trying to do anything intelligent or consistent. So this is the side of the story that when I, as a essentially conservative content, even though I'm not entirely sure to be, so not because I'm a liberal, but say the idea of conservatism is vague by some degree. But mostly making kind of conservative content or conservatively interpretable content, I realized that most conservatives attract attention of, because it's the average conservative, just as you find pretty bad liberal average, do not understand this. They do not have a concept of civic education or think that democracy is a problem per se. They just claritize a category and they transform it into a superstition. The point of democracy, that I realize it's a bad word because the demos is the fourth estate, but another word, right? The idea of having people that are all kind of intelligent, rich, powerful, capable, and so having that kind of equality in superiority, not equality in nothingness, in misery, in underdevelopment. That would be surely better than living with kind of a more feudal type of control, because we would have a real unity. And the reason why we don't have this and why we develop modernity so in such a messed up way is primarily only our fault. It's not the fault of the model per se. And this is very often misunderstood. Let's tear down democracy because it doesn't work. You're just a moron. It doesn't make any difference, and it makes just things worse when you could just make them so better by being actually better. But this all starts from the assumption that you are a poor victim / hero / pure people, and this is the typically paranoid, puritanic, hypocritical delusion of the average no one that basically doesn't have any particular quality, talent, dignity, or intelligence, and that pretends that there are these terrible evil powers that are just destroying everything, but they still live with the highest life quality in the world for some strange reason. And aren't they so good, brave, and pure and brave to actually crush the system? Yeah, it's also because of the other people. Yes, it's true. But again, these other people are the same ones among which you are basically born and raised. So you can't even pretend you were born and raised in an igloo and, one day you came out and found other people that did not understand, right? So always look at yourself before you think that there is, you have spot the problem. It's always about you at the end of the day, in everything. Right? For better, for worse. In any case, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.